All right, exploration 4 is the last exploration of lesson 2 and the last exploration of unit 2 and is all about the cell membrane. Now, we've talked a little bit about the cell membrane when we talked about parts of the cell, but in this exploration, we're going to go into a lot more detail about what it's made out of, how it works, and how it plays a very important role in maintaining homeostasis in cells. All right, so just to recap, the cell membrane, also called the plasma membrane, is a structure around the outside of a cell that controls what materials can enter and exit the cell. All right. All cells have a cell membrane, whether you're a plant cell or an animal cell. And for what it's worth, they're both very similar in terms of how they're structured. All right. So let's take a look at, let's talk about what they look like. The cell membrane consists of what we call a phospholipid bilayer, meaning there are two layers of phospholipids. And we learned about phospholipids in exploration 2. Phospholipids are a type of lipid, and which means they're a fat. Now, because of this, they have a structure that is non-polar, and this causes some issues when it relates to the cell membrane. It kind of impacts what types of things can pass through it and what types of things can't. But because of this, it does allow some perfect structural components. So here's a picture of it. Here's that picture of the phospholipid where we have the head and the tail. And what happens here is that the tail portions orient together and the head portions are opposite of each other. And what this does is it kind of creates an invisible shield that prevents things from easily entering or exiting this space. All right, it creates a little bit of a double barrier. Now, there are certain things that can pass through this, but for the most part, what I want to point out here are these structures, okay? All of these structures that go all the way through the membrane are different types of proteins. And so we're going to talk about what some of these proteins are and what they do, and how these proteins help to control what substances can cross that membrane. All right, now that's basically what this talks about right here. Now, there's a term that we use when we talk about the cell membrane, and it is this term right here, selectively permeable, or we say that the cell membrane has selective permeability. Now, what that means is that it allows some materials to cross, but others it does not. Now, we talked about how a cell membrane is kind of like a chain link fence, and how just like a chain link fence, there are certain substances that can pass right through, other substances that cannot. But this is where that idea of selective permeability comes from, is that some molecules can pass through, others can't. You know, one way to think about this is like a door guard or like a bouncer at a club or a bar. Somebody that's going to check to make sure who's coming in and out, make sure that they're old enough, or make sure that they have the right credentials, if there's some sort of an exclusive list. So that's what the cell membrane does, is they control what comes in and out of the cell, and we say that that is semi-permeability. All right, now let's talk about the different types of transport. Substances are going to pass across the cell membrane, and if it doesn't require any energy to do that, we call that passive transport. Now, there are lots of substances that can passively transport across the cell membrane. One of the more common ones are gases. So gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide are able to passively transport across the cell membrane whenever they want to. Now, here's what that means. When we talk about passive transport, we say that molecules are moving with a concentration gradient. In other words, they are moving where they're from a direction where there's a lot of them, like you see here, and they are passing across the cell membrane to space where there's less of them. In other words, they are moving from high concentration to low concentration. And as long as they're doing that, as long as that's the direction that they're moving, this doesn't require any energy. Now, in previous years, I've done a little bit of an example with my students where I pack everybody into a tiny corner of the room. And I ask them, where do you want to move right now? And inevitably what they say is they want to spread out. They want to get away from each other. It's very uncomfortable to all be packed in a tiny area. Well, molecules feel the same way. When you pack molecules together, what they want to do is they want to spread out. And so that's this movement right here. They are spreading out from an area where there's lots of them to the only other area available where there's less of them. And that's called passive transport, whenever they're moving from high to low concentration. All right. Now, there's a term for this when it happens with gases, and it's called diffusion. All right. And really not just gases, but anything in general. Anytime a substance moves from a high concentration to low concentration, that is called diffusion. All right. Now, again, what we use to describe diffusion is a concentration gradient where there is high concentration on one side and low concentration on another. And as long as molecules are moving from that high concentration to low concentration, that's what we call diffusion. Now, there's some really good videos here that I'm going to have you go back and watch on your own. I'm not going to show them to you in this screen recording for the sake of time, but I'd highly recommend you go back and watch them on your own. All right. Now, some molecules cannot simply go through the membrane because they're too big. And so they need a special gate to get through. And when that happens, we call that facilitated diffusion. Now I'm going to scroll back up here for just a second. Facilitated diffusion is any time you have substances that need help. They need a special channel to get through. All right. Now, facilitated can happen with passive transport, where there is no energy required, where you simply need a concentration gradient like you see here. And it can also happen with the other type of transport we're going to talk about, which is active transport. All right. Now, active transport is where you have molecules that are going against the concentration gradient. Anytime you have molecules going from where there is a low concentration to where there is a high concentration, that's going to require additional energy. Now, there's a couple of ways that this happens in cells. The one that we fit into with facilitated diffusion or facilitated transport is where it goes through a protein. Now, right here is another video that I would highly recommend that you watch. But I want to go back up to this picture because in this picture, it's showing you an example of a protein that's going to help with this process of active transport. What this protein is basically doing is it's opening on one side and closing on the other. And when it does this, it's forcing molecules from a lower area up into a higher area. All right. Now, this is called a proton pump. And this happens a lot in our muscle cells, where our muscle cells are needing to stockpile sodium and they're needing to eliminate potassium. All right. The next topic is osmosis. And osmosis is very similar to diffusion, except when we talk about osmosis, we're specifically going to be talking about water. Water molecules are unique because they are polar, but in this process, it's the same idea as diffusion, where your water molecules are always going to be moving from an area of high concentration of water molecules to an area of low concentration of water molecules. Now, when we talk about this, it can sometimes get tricky because we have to make sure we know what we're talking about, whether we're talking about water or whether we're talking about the particles that are dissolved in that water. Okay, so here's a good picture. In this picture, there is an even volume of water molecules on either side of this membrane. You can see the membrane in the middle. But what the water molecules are going to want to do is they're going to want to even out the concentration on both sides of this membrane. So what you're going to see happening is you're going to see water move from this side of the beaker over to this side. Now the volume is not the same anymore, but now there is the same concentration of solute dissolved in the water on both sides. All right, and so that's what we have when we have osmosis. This is how plants are able to absorb water, by the way. They are able to absorb the water from the ground into their roots because there is a lower concentration of water in their roots. So water moves from high to low concentration into their root system. All right, there's one more type of active transport that we're going to discuss, and this is called vesicular transport. All right, because they are using vesicles to do this. Now, when cells need to move large substances, the key here is large substances. We need to move large substances in or out of the cell. We're going to use something called vesicular transport, and there are two types. The first type is called endocytosis, because in endocytosis, a large substance is entering the cell. And what happens during endocytosis is exactly what you see here. The cell membrane pinches and folds around this large object. And then the membrane that was created around it, as it pinches into the cell, dissolves and is broken down, and the substance is then released into the cell. All right, so this is what happens when a cell needs to absorb a large molecule. Now, this could be a signaling molecule, could be a lipid from another cell, but whenever it's a large molecule that can't even fit through a protein, we have to do something like this. Now, the other type is exocytosis. Exocytosis is where we need to eliminate a large amount of substance. This is typically when we want to eliminate waste or any other, it could be a signaling molecule, but a lot of times it's waste products, where we form this vesicle around the waste products. Then we move it towards the surface, and when the vesicle fuses with the cell membrane, it creates an area for that substance to be removed. I always think of like an airlock on a spaceship. My kids love to watch the movie WALL-E. And in WALL-E, there's a system like this. They take a large amount of substance, they move it to the edge of the ship, they close off one side, and then they release the other side out into space. And that's basically what you're seeing here. Okay? When large substances need to be moved, we say that exocytosis is when those substances are released because they are exiting the cell. All right, so that's it for the cell membrane, and that's it for Unit 2, Lesson 2.